It's been 269 days since the Ukraine-Russia war started. Over 3 years now. Recently, there was a big meeting in Alaska between Donald Trump, the American president, and Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. A lot of hopes were pinned on this meeting, thinking it might lead to a breakthrough. Before this, Steve Witwer had been to Russia multiple times for negotiations. Usually, when heads of state meet like this and invite another president to their country, it's a big deal. If Trump invited Putin to Alaska, people usually assume that something big has already been decided and that the presidents, the top officials of two countries, have come together to put the final seal on that decision. But when their meeting happened late at night, Pakistan time, it became clear that nothing was actually settled. However, two things stood out clearly. First, Putin and Donald Trump, the Russian and American presidents, both came into this meeting with very different intentions. In this meeting in Alaska, Russian President Vladimir Putin came to show and make it clear that American President Donald Trump, as well as his supporters in the US, should understand that viewing Russia only from a European perspective is harmful for both America and Russia. If America stops looking at Russia through Europe's lens, there's a lot of potential for cooperation between the two countries. Throughout the meeting, he focused on this point, and it was clearly evident. Another thing about his visit, the point was to show that he is not isolated. He has connections with the most powerful country in the world, America. His relationships with their president are good. They can meet, chat, and discuss future scenarios. By the end of this video, you'll clearly understand what topics were discussed. Meanwhile, Donald Trump seemed to be there for just two reasons. One, to show the world that he really is a peacemaker, a deal maker, and deserves a Nobel Prize. The second is that during his election campaign, he wanted to fulfill his biggest promise, that he was capable of ending the Russia-Ukraine war and had the ability to do so. But here, he couldn't prove that. The deal didn't happen. Why not? There's a pretty big reason for that. The two main players in this deal, Ukraine and Europe, are against all the points and terms that Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump wanted to agree on. Before this meeting, when the two met, they both came down from their own preparations and the red carpet. So while walking, they came face to face. They shook hands. Then there was a lot of talk about body language, which often doesn't really mean much. The way it's portrayed usually isn't the truth. Apart from some interesting phrases, it's not really important. The reason is that many of the body language rules, when applied forcefully to heads of state and such situations, just backfire. Because the real status of a person is what actually shows. In a weak and a strong conversation, the actual situation doesn't always show up the way you'd expect. For example, it's said that when Donald Trump reaches out his hand, he does it in a way that the other person can place their hand on top of his. From the outside, it looks like a sign of submission, that Trump is putting his hand down and giving the other person a chance to show dominance through body language. But right after that, Trump does something else. He places his other hand on top of the first one. They pat you, try to show they're superior in the meeting through their body language. But right at that moment, the ones analyzing body language forget that the other person's hand is free too, and they can put their hand over it. It's not a big deal. But I'm against this way of trying to judge a meeting or its outcome based on body language, even before it starts, because it's really misleading. I noticed that a lot of international news channels were discussing these things. But as you saw, after the meeting, all those assumptions turned out to be wrong. Yeah, after the meeting, the main thing you could see on both their faces was that one guy looked really tired and the other looked fresh. And obviously, Donald Trump looked exhausted, which makes sense for a bunch of reasons. For one, he's about 7 years older than Vladimir Putin. Putin is 72 and Trump is 79. He's turning 80 in 8 months. So, even while he was getting off the plane, you could tell his age and fatigue. He was looking at the steps, taking them one by one. He kept holding onto the railing steadily. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin was coming down a bit faster. Obviously, he's younger than Donald Trump. What else could explain it? Yeah, he's old, but compared to Trump, he's a bit younger. Plus, his walk was a bit quicker too. Clearly, that's just what age demands. Donald Trump is a bit younger. When you see them face to face, since Trump is a tall guy, about 6'3", it's obvious he'll look dominant at first glance compared to Putin, who's barely 5'7". Visually, Trump comes across as the big man, clearly in charge. But will the negotiation play out the same way you saw in those talks, which were said to last just 2 hours before the meeting? After that, some points will be settled. Then there will be 6 more hours of discussion on those points. So there are 2 rounds. But you saw that the first round lasted 3 hours instead of 2 and ended without any result. Why? Because there was no chance for the next 6 hours of talks. And right there, the negotiations and dialogue had to be stopped. They had to hold a joint press conference. A press conference where no questions were taken, which really isn't a proper press conference. It's more like a press briefing or just a short speech from both sides. So, obviously, this was the main point of the whole meeting, and all those claims about body language turned out to be wrong because the story was actually the opposite. What was it? It was that Donald Trump, who had been talking non-stop about a land swap for several days before this meeting, claimed he had a formula to get a peace deal and ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. And that formula is the land swap. The common understanding of a land swap is that each side returns the other's land. Basically, an exchange of territory. When a war ends, it really ends like the 1965 war between Pakistan and India, where there was also some land conflict. But back then, people were misleading the whole world. Now, such a deal between Russia and Ukraine just isn't possible. The thing is, Russia currently controls over 19%, almost 20% of Ukraine's territory. Meanwhile, Ukraine controls barely any Russian land. There's a region called Kursk, which is quite small, about 450 square miles or square kilometers in area. The distance is so small, that Russia can take it back anytime. And compared to this 450 square kilometers, the area Russia holds in Ukraine is over 14,000 square kilometers. Every day, this occupied area by Russia in Ukraine is slowly increasing. So, there's no question of any land swap here. In the Kursk region, only a tiny part, about 40-50 square kilometers, is held by Ukrainian forces, while Russia controls most of it. Just something to remember. Russia can take it back at any time. But there are a lot of military aspects to consider. We talked about this in detail in one of our videos. One angle is that Russia might not even want to fully take it back, because the small region Ukraine has now means that as long as the war goes on, a lot of Ukrainian forces will have to stay on defense there. And since Ukraine is on the offensive compared to Russia, they need a lot of troops spread out over long defense lines, plus a lot of weapons. If you want the best weapons, only then can he hold that area. Because now it's also about his prestige. He has to hold on to at least some part of it. Ukraine is putting a lot of energy and soldiers into that. As long as the war continues, Russia benefits because a part of Ukraine's forces will be tied up in the Kursk region. This way, in the rest of the Western Front, where Russia is fighting Ukraine, there won't be as much concentration of Ukrainian forces. If Russia manages to take Kursk from them today, it would be a big success. So, all the forces coming out from there will obviously head to the Western Front, making things even tougher for Russia than they already are. The Kursk region is so small that it doesn't even count in terms of land swaps. Russia isn't counting it, and neither is any other country. Actually, when Donald Trump talked about land swaps, he was being misleading. What he was really saying was that Russia should keep Crimea and the Donbas region. And as for the rest of the regions, just give Ukraine back control and recognize its sovereignty. Obviously, this isn't a land swap. It's just that if Russia controls 20% of the area, they keep 10% and give back 10%. It's not a land swap. It means Russia will pull back that much. That's why the talks are about Russia agreeing to keep 10%. Its sovereignty over that area is accepted, which, as you know, Russia, Europe, and Ukraine haven't agreed on yet. Because Russia's demand is that it wants the Dnipro River. So they claim the entire region and will never give up what they've already taken over. On the other hand, Ukraine and Europe are demanding that maybe Russia might compromise on Crimea, but all the other areas Russia occupied after February 2022 must have their forces pulled back. So there was no mention of any land swap at all in their joint briefing. This basically means that the whole land swap idea, which Donald Trump had made a big deal about, was either not discussed or completely ignored. Russia basically sidelined him so completely that there was no chance for any further talks involving him. That's why no one from either side even mentioned him once. So, that's one thing about this press conference, this press briefing. The other thing is, 3 hours later, when the meeting suddenly ended and everyone came into the briefing room where Putin and Donald Trump were supposed to talk, surprisingly, Putin started speaking. He talked confidently for almost 8 minutes and 40 seconds reading from prepared notes that were already written down. He was reading, which means he came well prepared. These notes were either already written or he had brought them along. After the meeting, there were a few changes made because writing so many detailed notes in such polished diplomatic language within 3 hours is, in my opinion, pretty tough. So, my guess is that he had the notes prepared beforehand with just a few tweaks made on the spot before he read them out. Also, these notes he read during the briefing were addressed to. It took 1 minute and 40 seconds. Remember, the total press conference was 12 minutes. This was just a press briefing. Out of the 8 minutes and 40 seconds, they only spent about 2 minutes on Ukraine. Actually, less than that, around 1 minute and 50 seconds. The rest of the talk was all about the relationship between the US and Russia. They were indirectly addressing the Americans, obviously talking to Donald Trump, telling him that the US and Russia are actually neighbors, and between them, there are some islands, like in Alaska and Russia, where there's a small place called Bering Strait. But the distance is only 4 kilometers. That means we're just 4 kilometers apart, neighbors, basically. So close that between Europe and America, there's thousands of kilometers. The entire Atlantic Ocean. That kind of distance isn't between us. We're neighbors, and our relationship shouldn't be viewed from a European perspective. Then he mentioned a bunch of business opportunities, saying if America and Russia teamed up, imagine what they could do in the world. He also reminded everyone that in World War II, America and Russia actually, they lived together. You might remember that after when Berlin was captured and Nazi Germany was defeated, it was actually the Russians who reached Hitler first with help from America. Because America was attacking from one side and a lot of weapons for Russia were coming from America too. So they reminded everyone that if we both come together, we can win even the biggest wars in the world. After that, they reminded the Americans and Donald Trump that on the very ground where I'm standing today, there are over 200 names from here. Those places are still Russian, even today, and you bought this piece of land from us. Because of that, we have a historical connection. We have a relationship tied to this land. They mentioned a lot of venues and fields, saying how America and Russia together could make great progress in these areas. For example, they talked about the Arctic Ocean, that is the North Pole, where we both could do a lot of scientific explorations. We could work on many different funding opportunities. They also mentioned space exploration. We can work together. We can do a lot in the energy sector because, as you know, both countries have huge amounts of oil and gas. So their point was that if we join forces, we'll have the largest oil and gas reserves in the world between us. Our monopoly would be massive, bigger than OPE. So we should definitely work on this. Then they said we can do a lot in technology too. They were presenting all these various trade opportunities to American businessmen. Remember when he was saying this? There were Russian and American businessmen right in front of him. That meeting with Go lasted 3 full hours. Alongside the Russian president, he had 3 advisors with him. Similarly, Donald Trump also had 3 advisors with him: Wazir Khaja, Steve Koff, and Ekcham. So, apart from this 4, by 4 meeting, most of the rest of the delegation was made up of businessmen, especially from the Russian side. So, from their perspective, this was completely different kind of meeting. Keep this meeting in mind. It was mentioned at the start. It should be one-on-one. Putin said no, it won't be a one-on-one meeting. Instead, our small councils will be there with us. Our small council will be present, meaning a foreign minister, an advisor, and a translator. Keep in mind, Putin can speak English. He speaks very little, but he can. That's why, at the end of this press conference briefing, he even invited Trump to come to Moscow. He said, let's have the next meeting in Moscow. Basically, America should strengthen ties with us and put Europe aside. That's the whole point. The conversation they had in front of the cameras clearly shows what probably went down in that 3-hour meeting. Pitt side likely tried hard to emphasize what we can achieve together in the world. Maybe that's why Donald Trump looked pretty tired. He had other types of meetings planned and different things on his mind that were a higher priority at the time. In the briefing, which lasted just over 1 minute and 50 seconds, he first acknowledged that our meeting. A basic part of this is Ukraine, and they said people might feel conflicted, but we consider Ukrainians as our brothers. Historically, we share the same history. Our origin is the same, but the reason for the current situation is that Russia wants some security guarantees. Obviously, what they've been saying from day one is that Ukraine shouldn't become part of NATO. They want it demilitarized with no Western military influence whatsoever, and it should never be in a position that poses a threat to Russia. It's exactly the same situation as before. America would never want Mexico to make a security deal with China that allows Chinese or Russian military bases there. They've been saying this from day one. They basically said here that without addressing the core issues, the root causes, you can't have long-term peace. That was their main point, in short. Then they added, yeah, they understand Ukraine needs security guarantees, and they're open to discussing that. They also said Europe needs security guarantees, and they're ready for that too. So these were the 3 quick points he made about the Ukraine war in just 1 minute and 50 seconds, which everyone was hyping up as the main reason for the whole meeting. But actually, over 70%, almost 80% of the conversation was about trade with the US, which they know is Donald Trump's weak spot because it benefits him a lot. Another masterstroke in this meeting by Vladimir Putin was that at the very end of the whole discussion, just before Donald Trump spoke, he said a flattering last line. If Biden hadn't been president and Donald Trump was in his place, the whole Russia, Ukraine, war, this operation, this conflict would never have happened. Obviously, Trump really likes this idea and keeps saying that if he were president, there would never have been a war because he believes the 2020 election was basically rigged against him. He thinks the election was stolen from him. So he doesn't accept that election and keeps saying that if he were in charge, this war wouldn't have happened. He really likes this narrative. So when Vladimir Putin said this as his last sentence, it basically meant he was playing a masterstroke. Now that Donald Trump has started talking, he's already heard the sweet talk. It's like music to his ears. So whatever Trump says next, it's obvious it won't be too harsh against Russia. And that's exactly what happened. Because Trump had been saying for days that if Putin didn't listen to him and move towards a ceasefire or a peace deal, there would be consequences. Obviously, the first thing that meant was sanctions. So, in the last 4 minutes, actually 3 minutes and some seconds of his talk, Donald Trump didn't say anything strict or harsh about sanctions on Russia or their consequences. Instead, he mentioned that we have some agreements based on which we can move forward. Both of them kind of hinted at this. Vladimir Putin used the word agreements, which basically means there are some deals they can continue discussing. But what Trump said after that was that he would talk to the Ukrainian president, NATO, and his European allies.